Usually when you talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there is a fundamental expectation of precision.
Right, absolutely.
Like, say you break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line right there in your radius. The doctor points at the film and says, well, there it is.
It's binary.
Exactly. It's broken or it's not broken.
And I mean, that's comforting because it is entirely legible to us. We are hardwired to like things that are visible, categorizable, things that are easily solved with a cast and like 6 weeks of rest.
Yeah, but step out of the ER and into the world of neurodevelopment or trauma or interpersonal psychology, and suddenly that x-ray machine is totally useless.
Oh, completely useless. You are suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just completely murky.
Right. You can't put a fractured relationship or a traumatized psyche on a light box.
No, you really can't. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. The variables are just infinite.
And if diagnosing a single human individual is murky, diagnosing society is, it's like trying to navigate those muddy waters blindfolded in a hurricane.
That is a great way to put it.
So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a massive stack of incredibly intense, multifaceted information for you. We've got historical policy documents, academic essays on psychological aggression, peer-reviewed neuroscience, and some highly charged sociological analysis.
It is a heavy stack of reading.
It really is.
Okay.
And we are unpacking how our society diagnoses and handles domestic violence and institutionalized aggression.
Specifically, we are tracing the history of domestic violence research. We're going to look really closely at the Duluth model, which is the most widely adopted domestic violence intervention program in the world.
Right.
And we're examining a very disturbing argument from the sources. The idea that policies originally designed to protect victims have, evolved into rigid, fraudulent frameworks that assume a strict binary.
Meaning the assumption that men are inherent aggressors and women are inherent victims.
Well,
and we'll be looking at the real-world fallout of that assumption for you, especially regarding mandatory arrest policies and what happens when injured people call for help and literally find themselves in handcuffs.
yeah, the case studies on that are rough.
But look, before we get into it, we need to be totally upfront with you about the terrain we are crossing today.
Definitely.
The material we are diving into contains highly politically charged content. It touches on some of the most sensitive, explosive issues in our cultural discourse right now. And the arguments come from, various points on the ideological spectrum.
So we need to be clear that we are absolutely not taking sides here.
Right. We aren't endorsing any specific viewpoints or validating the political framing of these authors. Our mission is just to act as your analysts.
We are impartially mapping the ideas, the data, and the arguments presented in this text so you can understand the architecture of this massive societal debate.
Because knowledge requires context, right? Especially when we were talking about systems that can strip a person of their freedom or their reputation.
Exactly. Our goal is to synthesize this, spot the patterns, and look at the actual mechanisms of how these policies function in the real world.
So we're going to trace the history of state intervention, examine the actual admissions made by the creators of the world's standard domestic violence model, look at the consequences of mandatory arrest, and then expand into how our institutions handle overt physical aggression versus covert psychological aggression.
Let's start at the beginning then, because you really can't understand a policy until you understand the vacuum it was trying to fill.
Right, like how did we get from domestic violence being treated as a quote-unquote private family matter to a highly criminalized state-mandated issue?
Well, if you look at the historical timeline, before the 1970s, the state essentially washed its hands of family violence.
Completely.
Yeah, for centuries, the state categorized spousal battery not as a crime against the public order, but as a relationship malady. It fell almost entirely outside the jurisdiction of the criminal legal system.
Which is wild to think about today.
It is. The prevailing legal and cultural attitude was, a man's home was his castle, and what happened inside was a private domain.
So victims just suffered in total silence.
And when they did reach out to law enforcement, they encountered a massive wall of systemic apathy.
Yeah, and there is a historical detail in the documents that literally forced me to stop reading and just stare at the wall for a minute.
The stitch rules.
The stitch rules. I mean, they mentioned that police departments in major cities, places like Chicago and New York, operated on these informal heuristics.
It's hard to believe.
Officers literally would not arrest a husband unless his wife required a specific number of surgical sutures.
Yeah.
You needed a literal quota of stitches to trigger an arrest.
I know, it perfectly illustrates the institutional mindset of the era, though. The police were trained to be conflict managers, not law enforcement officers, when they crossed the threshold of a home.
So they weren't looking for a crime scene.
No, their primary directive was basically to walk the husband around the block to cool him down, attempt to mediate the dispute, and just leave.
Wow.
Physical violence, unless it crossed an extreme, highly visible threshold of lethality, was just viewed as a symptom of a dysfunctional marriage. And mid-20th century psychology heavily reinforced this, by the way.
Wait, how so? Were psychologists actually telling police not to arrest abusers?
Not explicitly, but the psychological framework of the 1950s and 60s viewed physical abuse as a pathological problem residing within the relationship dynamic.
Like it was a mutual issue.
Exactly. It was framed as a codependent dysfunction. Psychologists essentially prescribed couples counseling to repair the relationship, which unfortunately inadvertently treated both the perpetrator and the victim as equal contributors to the violence.
So the focus was on what? Communication skills.
Communication skills, stress management, mutual psychological adjustment.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the prevailing thought was, hey, you two just need to communicate your feelings better, completely ignoring the reality that one person is terrified and in physical danger.
Precisely. And this systemic failure is exactly what birthed feminist criminology in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Okay, that makes sense.
Activists rejected that psychological framing entirely. They argued, quite effectively, that treating domestic violence as a mere personality defect or communication breakdown gave perpetrators absolute impunity.
Because it ignored the root cause.
Right, and they identified that root cause as power and control, specifically patriarchal power and control.
I mean, weren't they entirely justified in forcing the issue? If the state is ignoring people who are being beaten in their own homes and hiding behind couples counseling while utilizing stitch rules, you have to shatter that apathy somehow.
Though, without a doubt.
And the activists didn't just write academic papers, right? They sued police departments. They sued the NYPD. They sued the Oakland Police Department for failure to protect.
They did, and they were phenomenally successful in the courts. One of the most pivotal moments was a massive $2.3 million judgment against a police department in Connecticut.
Wow, $2.3 million back then was huge.
Massive. It was for failing to protect a woman from her estranged husband despite repeated violent threats. And that financial liability terrified municipalities across the country.
Because a multi-million-dollar payout will change municipal policy way faster than any moral argument ever could.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in response to these lawsuits, police departments began throwing out their conflict resolution playbooks. They began codifying the legal requirement to arrest.
Just to cover their own liability.
Basically. In 1987, Oregon passed laws requiring police to make arrests when an officer had probable cause, which paved the way for the massive federal legislation that would follow.
Okay, I follow the logic. The state was failing. Activists applied legal pressure. The state panicked over the liability, and they shifted to a hardline criminalization approach.
Breeze.
It's like steering a massive ship away from an iceberg, right? You see the iceberg of state apathy, and you turn the wheel as hard as you can to avoid it.
That's a good analogy.
But the fundamental question raised by this material is, did they lock the steering wheel in place and completely overcorrect?
That is the core argument we have to analyze today.
Like, did the momentum of pivoting away from those early psychological explanations pave the way for an ideological framework that abandoned science altogether?
Well, the sudden, desperate need for a standardized, forceful response to domestic violence created a massive bureaucratic vacuum. Police departments, judges, social workers, they all suddenly needed a unified operating procedure.
Right, they needed rules.
And that vacuum was filled by what would become the most influential and controversial domestic violence framework in the entire world, the Duluth model.
Okay, this is where the story gets surreal. We have a detailed breakdown in our sources of a college textbook from 1999 called Coordinating Community Responses. Domestic Violence Lessons from Duluth and Beyond.
Yeah, and the author is key here.
Right. It is co-authored by Ellen Pence, one of the 3 original founders of the Duluth model. We aren't analyzing third-party critiques here. We're looking at Pence's own written admissions about how she built this globally adopted program.
The candor in chapter 2 of her book, which is ironically titled Some Thoughts on Philosophy, is just remarkable.
It's shocking.
She explicitly outlines who the Duluth model staff were and details their total lack of formal credentials in psychology, criminology, or the sciences.
Wait, they had no scientific background?
None.
Yeah.
She states the organizers were 3 women. One was a respected shelter organizer. Another was a shelter volunteer with office management experience who, Pence notes, quote, made us look far more professional than we actually were.
I mean, that's a red flag right there. And then there's Pence herself.
Yes.
She writes, and this is a quote, "I was the third, an outsider from Minneapolis whose father was a salesman and mother a Catholic. My specialty was selling guilt."
Selling guilt.
When you are building a legal intervention program that will dictate how men and women are processed by the criminal justice system, admitting your primary skill is selling guilt is a staggering foundational premise.
It really is. The critique here is that Pence is admitting they were activists operating behind a false professional front, using emotional manipulation to secure institutional compliance.
I could almost forgive the lack of credentials if they, I don't know, brought in scientists to help them analyze the data. But it goes so much deeper than just not having a PhD.
Oh, significantly deeper.
Pence writes that the Duluth staff actively argued against scientific causal explanations for domestic violence. Like, prior to Duluth, peer-reviewed science linked domestic violence to a variety of complex factors.
Right, things like substance abuse, poverty, generational trauma, psychological instability.
But Pence explicitly states they rejected explanations that require them to assume any, quote, universal psychological makeup among abusers.
They threw out the psychology because it interfered with the sociology they wanted to implement. They needed a single, universally applicable framework.
Right.
So they created the famous power and control wheel. Now, how they created it is crucial for you to understand.
Yeah, break this down because this part is wild.
Pence explains that originally, when they interviewed women in battered women's groups, the women described the violence by saying when he is violent, he gets power and he gets control.
Meaning the power and control were a result or a byproduct of the violent outburst.
Exactly. But Pence admits the staff actively changed that message. They altered it to, quote, he is violent in order to get control or power.
They completely flipped the causality.
They did. And Pence explicitly writes, the difference is not semantic, it is ideological.
They changed it from an uncontrolled emotional outburst that results in dominance to a premeditated, calculated strategy utilized specifically to enforce patriarchal subjugation.
Yes. And she admits they even created advocacy jingles to drill this in.
Jingles?
Yeah, literally. He does it for power, he does it for control, and he does it because he can't.
It is the literal manufacturing of an ideological axiom.
But the most revealing moment is what happens when they took this newly minted theory and tested it against reality.
Right, the real-world test.
Pence writes that when they interviewed men and women in the program, their conceptual framework, the power and control wheel, quote, did not fit the live experience of many of the men and women we were working with.
Wait a second. If you build a model to explain a phenomenon, and then you talk to the actual human beings experiencing the phenomenon, and they tell you your model is wrong, don't you change the model?
Well, in the scientific method, yes. In ideological activism, no.
That is insane.
Pence writes that many of the men she interviewed simply did not articulate a desire for power over their partner. Even when she relentlessly told them they were just in denial, they didn't fit the profile.
So they just refused to listen.
And yet she writes that the staff remained undaunted by the difference in our theory and the actual experiences of those we were working with.
Wow.
She admits outright, and this is a direct quote, we all engaged in ideological practices and claimed them as neutral observations.
I'm really struggling to reconcile this. We engaged in ideological practices and claim of them as neutral observations. She is confessing to empirical fraud in her own textbook.
Yes.
She says they eventually realized they were, quote, finding what we had already predetermined to find. What did they do when they encountered evidence that actively destroyed their ideology? Like, what about female abusers?
They ignored it entirely. When confronted with women's violence toward their partners, or violence within lesbian relationships, or women's severe substance abuse and the harsh physical treatment of their own children, Pence admits they, quote, turned a blind eye.
How do you justify turning a blind eye to a mother abusing a child just because it doesn't fit your gender wheel?
The justification provided is rooted in a siege mentality. Pence notes they felt they were fighting a constant societal undercurrent that accused women of being liars or hysterical.
Which was a real historical issue,
Well,
obviously.
definitely. But in response to that prejudice, she says they felt forced to push a counter-narrative that women are saints.
Women are saints.
Right. They needed domestic violence to be a rigidly, exclusively gendered issue. Male oppressor, female victim.
So any deviation breaks the model.
Exactly. Acknowledging that women could be primary physical aggressors or that violence existed outside the heterosexual male dominance paradigm threatened the structural integrity of their entire political project. So the data was just discarded.
Okay, I have to stop and play the skeptic here for a minute.
Go for it.
If the creators of this model published a book admitting they had no scientific training, that they sold guilt, that they altered victim testimonies to fit a predetermined narrative, and that they actively ignored female violence to protect a women are saints ideology, how on earth does this become the blueprint for the global justice system?
It's a valid question.
How does this pass the smell test of any judge, police chief, or academic institution?
Because you are looking for scientific rigor where the institutions were looking for logistical efficiency. Remember the massive lawsuits we talked about? The police departments bleeding millions of dollars?
Yeah, the panic.
The justice system was desperate. They didn't have time for the nuanced, murky realities of human psychology, generational trauma, or the complexities of mutual abuse. They needed a flowchart.
They needed rules they could enforce blindly.
They needed standard operating procedures that could be mass-produced, printed on laminated cards, and handed to a patrol officer at 2 a.m.
It's an algorithm.
Precisely. The Duluth model offered an incredibly simple, easily replicable algorithm. Man equals oppressor seeking power. Woman equals innocent victim without agency. If there is violence, the man is the cause.
Wow.
It took a massively complex human tragedy and turned it into a binary equation.
It's an easy pill for a bureaucracy to swallow.
It is the ultimate bureaucratic convenience, and that convenience led to what the analysis calls widespread institutional brainwashing.
Which affected everyone.
Judges, doctors, lawyers, military commanders, and police academies were all trained to perceive domestic disputes exclusively through this rigid lens. The model wasn't adopted because it was empirically true. It was adopted because it was an organizer's miracle.
It allowed the state to process bodies through the system efficiently.
Exactly.
But ideas don't stay in textbooks, right?
Yeah.
They harden into laws.
Right.
And because this framework explicitly assumed male guilt by default, we have to look at what happens when that algorithm is handed a badge and a gun.
Right.
Because that brings us to the actual policy implementations. Mandatory arrest and no-drop policies.
The transition from activist philosophy to legal mandate was highly aggressive. The Duluth model advocates realized that changing police culture wasn't enough. They had to remove police discretion entirely, take the decision-making away from the officer on the scene.
And more importantly, they felt they had to remove the victim's discretion.
Wait, why the victims?
Pence writes that they wanted to change the climate of tolerance, but they faced a constant hurdle. Victims who refused to cooperate with the prosecution.
Oh, like what happens when a woman calls the police to defuse a situation, but absolutely does not want her husband arrested or put in jail? Exactly. The activist response, according to the text, was to neutralize the offender's ability to control the process. But the way they did that was by neutralizing the victim's agency.
They created no-drop policies.
Right.
Which means the state takes over the charges. Even if the victim goes to the prosecutor and begs them to drop the case, the state refuses. The state literally becomes the victim.
Paired with this were mandatory arrest policies. As Pence stated, quote, police could no longer ask the victim whether she wanted him arrested.
If the police arrive, someone is going in handcuffs.
Yes. And this didn't just stay at the municipal level. The Violence Against Women Act, or OWA, passed in 1993, heavily incentivized these policies by tying federal funding for states to the implementation of mandatory arrest laws.
Follow the money.
Today, over half the states in the U.S. have mandatory arrest laws on the books.
Now, I understand the theoretical benefit. The argument is that you are taking the weight off the victim's shoulders. The abuser can't threaten the victim into dropping the charges because the victim literally has no power to drop them.
The state steps in as the ultimate unyielding protector.
Right. But the sources highlight a massive constitutional collision here, specifically regarding the Sixth Amendment.
Yes, the confrontation clause of the Sixth Amendment. It guarantees a criminal defendant the right to be confronted with the witnesses against him.
It's a bedrock principle of justice, right?
Yeah.
You have the right to face your accuser, to cross-examine them, to challenge their narrative.
But the argument made here is that the Duluth model's explicit architectural goal was to circumvent that constitutional right. By shifting the burden entirely onto the state and making the state the de facto victim, they sought to neutralize the defendant's ability to dispute the testimony of the actual person involved.
Because the accuser doesn't even have to show up to court.
Exactly. The state prosecutes using the police report as the sole basis of reality.
They basically engineered a system designed to secure convictions without the messy reality of cross-examination. And the real-world fallout on the ground, specifically for male victims of domestic violence, is where this abstract legal theory turns into absolute horror. We have specific, visceral examples from the text of what happens when a rigidly gendered ideology meets a zero-discretion police policy.
The outcomes are deeply disturbing because they reveal a system that cannot process reality when it contradicts the algorithm.
Let's talk about the first case. There is the case of a man who gets into an altercation with his wife. She attacks him with a literal baseball bat. He manages to block the third swing from hitting his head, and in the process of blocking it, he injures her wrist, he suffers a fractured skull, he has a broken arm, he is bleeding profusely. The police arrive at the house.
And under the framework we've discussed, what happens?
They arrest the man with the fractured skull.
Yeah.
The police, operating under this feminist paradigm where the man is inherently the aggressor, using power and control and facing their mandatory arrest protocols, look at a man with his head caved in and a woman with a sprained wrist, and they arrest him.
It defies belief.
The source details that he was hauled off to jail and denied medical attention for 5 hours. He almost died from a traumatic brain injury because the police algorithm literally couldn't comprehend that the woman with the bat was the perpetrator.
The visual evidence of his victimization was entirely overridden by the ideological assumption of his guilt.
It's terrifying.
And there is another example that highlights how this applies even when the man initiates the call for help.
Oh, the cell phone one.
Yeah. A young man goes to his ex-girlfriend's apartment to retrieve his cell phone. She attacks him, kicking him so violently in the testicles that he collapses on the floor in sheer agony. He is the one who manages to dial 911. He begs for police assistance.
The police arrive. They find him rising on the floor, clearly incapacitated, and they arrest him. They put him in the back of the cruiser.
And it is only when they are driving to the station and realize he is going into shock and might actually die from internal injuries that they divert to the hospital.
And the kicker to this whole nightmare, he is subsequently convicted of domestic violence, and a judge orders him to take anger management courses.
This is what the commentary refers to as the paradox of the patriarchal judge.
What does that mean?
Well, the legal system, heavily influenced by this Duluth training, often acts in a way that profoundly infantilizes women. By treating women as perpetual, helpless victims without agency, even when they are wielding a baseball bat or inflicting severe, localized physical trauma, the system denies their capacity for violence.
It denies their agency just as thoroughly as it denies the male victim's physical suffering.
Exactly.
It just strips the humanity out of the equation. If domestic disturbance equals true, then arrest male. It assumes the man is the primary aggressor by virtue of his biology.
Right. If she has a scratch on her finger from him defending himself against a knife, he is the aggressor.
The system has developed a functional structural blindness to female-perpetrated harm. It is hyper-focused on male aggression, calibrating every instrument to detect and punish it, but it simply lacks the conceptual vocabulary to process female violence.
Which is a huge problem.
And what is truly terrifying about this material is that this blind spot isn't just limited to the police or physical domestic violence. It extends into how our entire society, our schools, our HR departments, our universities views and regulates psychological aggression.
The physical blindness translates directly into institutional blindness.
So let's shift layers here, moving from the physical violence of a domestic dispute to the sociological and psychological realm of institutional behavior.
We are drawing heavily now on a deep analytical essay from the Multiverse Journal titled The Invisible Weapon.
And the core thesis is this: Western institutions have systematically eliminated accountability for covert forms of social aggression, which are predominantly female-typical, while simultaneously amplifying the visibility and the penalties for overt forms of aggression, which are male-typical.
Right. To understand this, the essay opens with an incredibly grounded anecdote about a high school a teenage boy, and the actual neuroscience of human attention.
Yeah, I love this example.
A mother finds out her 16-year-old son is failing his math class. He can't concentrate. They rule out learning disorders, they rule out screen time. The issue is that several of his female classmates sit right next to him, wearing highly revealing clothing, skin-tight yoga pants, low-cut tops, and make no effort to adjust their presentation in a shared learning environment.
Now, in a functioning, neutral institution, this would be a practical discussion about shared space and mutual respect.
Sure.
But when the mother brings this up to the school administrator, the administrator's response is immediate and draconian. The problem is 100% the boy's fault.
Right. He needs to control his eyes. He needs to control his thoughts.
The institution places the entire moral, practical, and disciplinary burden on the male student.
And here is where the essay brings in the peer-reviewed neuroscience, and it completely dismantles the administrator's moral grandstanding.
The research demonstrates that sexual stimuli capture male attention involuntarily. It causes measurable physiological cognitive interference.
This isn't a moral failing or a lack of discipline. It is a hardwired biological attentional mechanism. The visual cortex and the limbic system react before the prefrontal cortex can apply conscious control.
It's automatic.
And as the essay points out, this involuntary attentional capture is physiologically amplified by testosterone. We are talking about a 16-year-old boy. His testosterone levels are peaking at the highest point they will ever be in his entire life.
The analogy the author uses is brilliant. Telling that teenage boy to just, quote-unquote, stop noticing the girl beside him through sheer moral effort is like putting a blaring car alarm in the middle of the classroom and telling him to stop noticing the noise.
It is biologically impossible. Your nervous system is designed to track that stimulus.
Yet, look at how the institution handles it. The institution treats the female presentation as entirely environmentally neutral. It is treated as a protected right of expression.
But it pathologizes the male nervous system's biological involuntary response. The female typical behavior is protected and normalized. The male typical biological reality is disciplined, shamed, or criminalized.
It's a perfect microcosm of the asymmetry. And that asymmetry maps perfectly onto how men and women express aggression and how institutions choose to punish it.
The essay goes deep into the weeds of aggression science, citing 55 years of research, starting with Norma Feshbach in 1969 and Kirsti Lagerspetz in the 1980s.
Because society operates on this sort of Disney-fied assumption that women are just naturally peaceful and less aggressive than men.
But the clinical research proves that is a total myth. Women are not less aggressive, they are just differently aggressive.
Differently aggressive.
This is a crucial distinction that our institutions refuse to acknowledge. Male aggression is predominantly direct. It is physical, it is loud, it is verbal. It is a visible hierarchical challenge for status.
Right. If a man gets angry and punches a coworker or yells in their face, it leaves physical evidence. Witnesses see it. HR can document it on a form. The police can arrest him.
Exactly. It is legible to the institutional apparatus.
But female aggression is a completely different mechanism.
Yeah.
The research shows women predominantly, almost exclusively, favor indirect aggression.
We are talking about social manipulation, reputational destruction, whisper networks, exclusion, rumor mongering, and gaslighting.
And the defining feature of indirect aggression, the evolutionary reason it developed, is that it is designed specifically to be invisible.
It is the perfect crime because it leaves no fingerprints. The researcher Kaj Bjerkquist noted across hundreds of cross-cultural studies that indirect aggression works precisely because it masks the harmful intent of the perpetrator.
It mimics normal social interaction.
Yes. The target knows they are being destroyed, but they usually can't prove it. If they try to complain about it to an HR manager or a school dean, they sound paranoid.
People are looking at me weird. They're excluding me from the email chains. They're whispers. It sounds like petty interpersonal drama, not a coordinated attack.
And this leads us to what is arguably the most terrifying concept in this entire analysis. Mobbing.
Mobbing. Heinz Lehmann, a Swedish psychologist working in the 1980s, dedicated his career to researching this phenomena.
He defined mobbing as the coordinated, sustained, covert psychological disruption of a target in a workplace or social setting.
It is vital to understand, for you listening, that mobbing is not one big explosive argument. It is the steady accumulation of hundreds of small, individually deniable microaggressive behaviors over months or years.
It is death by 1,000 paper cuts. It is isolation, systematic undermining, and constant subtle humiliation.
Lehmann studied the biological and psychological toll of this, and his findings are horrifying. The psychological damage inflicted by mobbing is equivalent to post-traumatic stress disorder,
PTSD.
the exact same clinical diagnosis given to combat veterans who have been in active war zones or victims of severe physical assault.
Lehman's work was corroborated by a massive subsequent meta-analysis involving over 115,000 participants. It confirmed that the depressive, traumatic, and physiological effects of workplace bullying and mobbing lead to massive spikes in cortisol, severe cardiovascular stress, psychiatric breakdowns, and tragically high rates of suicide.
The body processes social exclusion as a literal threat to survival.
Yes.
So let's pause on that mechanism for a second, because this is where the failure of the system becomes glaringly obvious. If we have peer-reviewed clinical data proving that mobbing causes PTSD-level trauma and drives people to suicide, why isn't human resources trained to spot it?
Right.
HR departments are highly trained to stop overt sexual harassment or physical threats. Why are they blind to this?
The author of the essay argues this isn't an accident, it is a structural blind spot created by a deliberate shift in institutional values. The modern institutional apparatus, HR departments, university Title IX offices, behavioral tribunals were explicitly built to address direct, visible aggression.
They function, in the author's precise terminology, as a one-way ratchet.
Meaning they only turn in one direction. They only catch one type of behavior.
Exactly. They heavily penalize the male-typical forms of conflict, but they offer absolutely zero remedy and zero protection for the covert, reputational destruction that characterizes female aggression.
The institution is structurally blind to the very harm that women are statistically far more likely to commit.
The essay highlights a disturbing data point. Female academics, when compared to male academics, show a systematically higher preference for social exclusion as a method of conflict resolution.
Think about the implications of that.
Right. So the very people who are disproportionately shaping university and institutional policies are favoring the exact aggressive mechanism that the institution is designed to ignore.
It creates a perfectly insulated predatory environment. A woman can slowly, methodically destroy a man's professional standing, his social life, and his psychological health over the course of years using whisper networks, false insinuations, and targeted exclusion.
And she will face absolutely no HR reprimand. There is no legal consequence.
But if that man, after months of psychological torture, reacts with a display of direct verbal aggression, like if he finally snaps, slams his fist on a desk, and yells at her in the office, what happens?
He is the one fired. He is terminated immediately for creating a quote-unquote hostile work environment and being a physical threat.
The institutional architecture protects the invisible weapon while maximally punishing the visible reaction. The system aids and abets the psychological destruction by demanding the victim suffer in silence and punishing them if they make the abuse legible.
And as the sources detail with incredible gravity, there is no sharper, more lethal and visible weapon in the arsenal of reputational destruction than the false accusation.
Absolutely not.
The whisper network reaches its terminal velocity when it invokes the law.
The asymmetry we just mapped in the workplace becomes magnified exponentially when we look at the actual legal system.
Yeah, the essay dives into the stark realities regarding false sexual accusations, utilizing data from the National Registry of Exonerations. The numbers are incredibly sobering.
Of those wrongfully convicted and later exonerated, representing over 25,600 years collectively served in prison by innocent people, 99% of them are male.
99%. It is an almost exclusively male phenomenon to have your life stolen by the state for a crime you didn't commit.
And in over half of those documented exoneration cases, perjury, fabricated evidence, or a false accusation played a direct role in the conviction.
Now, contrast the destruction of those men's lives with the consequence for the accusers.
Mm-hmm.
The data cited indicates that only 0.5% of sexual assault complaints ever lead to a perjury conviction or any legal consequence for the accuser who fabricated the lie.
Just let that sink in. A man can lose decades of his life in a maximum security prison based entirely on a fabricated story. He can suffer horrific institutional violence. He loses his family, his career, his youth.
While the person who intentionally manufactured that lie faces almost zero risk of consequence. It is a completely risk-free weapon.
And the damage doesn't even require a conviction. Even if the accusation never goes to trial, even if the police investigate and definitively dismiss it as unfounded, the man carries that mark forever.
It appears on background checks. Arrested for sexual assault, charges dismissed. His career is permanently stunted.
Meanwhile, the accuser walks away completely spotless, and in some social circles is actually praised for being brave for speaking out.
But the analysis points out that the legal system isn't just passively allowing this imbalance. In some jurisdictions, the system is actively working to make it worse.
Yes.
They point to the Jian Ghomeshi trial in Canada as the ultimate case study of institutional capture.
The Ghomeshi case is a watershed moment in legal asymmetry. John Ghomeshi, a prominent Canadian broadcaster, was acquitted of sexual assault charges.
And he wasn't acquitted on technicality.
No. He was acquitted because his defense lawyers surprised the complainants on the witness stand during cross-examination with their own electronic communications, emails, and text messages.
Messages which definitively proved the accusers were lying, coordinating their stories, and had maintained friendly, consensual contact with him long after the alleged assaults.
The judge explicitly found them guilty of outright deception. They tried to use the court to destroy a man, and they were caught red-handed committing perjury.
So naturally, the public demanded they be charged with perjury, right? Justice served, the system works.
The exact opposite happened. There was massive public outrage, not at the liars, but at the acquittal.
What?
The public protested that the defense was allowed to use evidence to catch the women lying, and the Canadian Parliament responded by passing Bill C-51, which became widely known as the Ghomeshi Rules.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this law.
Bill C-51 changed Canadian criminal procedure in a way that upends centuries of common law. It requires the defense to hand over any impeachment evidence like those contradictory text messages or emails to the accuser before the trial begins.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand the mechanism here. If I am falsely accused of a horrific crime and I possess an email from my accuser that proves she is fabricating the entire story, I have to give her that email before she takes the witness stand.
Yes.
I have to give her the exact map she needs to alter her lie so it fits the evidence.
You must forfeit the element of surprise, which is the primary tool used in cross-examination to expose perjury.
That is absurd.
The source quotes a Supreme Court justice dissenting against this law, stating explicitly that it violates the defendant's right against self-incrimination and destroys the presumption of innocence. The law was literally rewritten by the state to make it procedurally harder for an innocent defendant to catch a lying accuser in a perjury trap.
It is a legislative mechanism designed entirely to protect false accusers from being exposed. And it isn't just Canadian criminal courts. The source looks at how this rot has infected U.S. institutions, specifically federal science policy.
Yes, the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. They instituted a policy banning scientists from sitting on peer review panels if they have simply been accused of sexual harassment.
Not investigated, not found guilty, merely accused.
And the rationale the NIH provided is almost comical in its circular logic. They stated that an accused man might give artificially high scores to female applicants in order to avoid appearing biased.
So it creates a Kafkaesque presumed conflict of interest. The institution acts immediately on the accusation alone, stripping the man of his professional standing and his influence in the scientific community while demanding absolutely zero proof from the accuser.
The whisper alone is enough to execute the professional death sentence.
The essay then shifts the lens from everyday individuals to cultural figures. It analyzes the mechanisms used to destroy Bill Cosby and Michael Jackson. Now, let me be very clear again for you listening. The author is maintaining strict neutrality on the ultimate factual guilt or innocence of these specific men.
Yes, the essay is not relitigating the evidence of their cases. What it is doing is analyzing the sociological mechanism of their destruction and exploring why they specifically were targeted by these massive coordinated campaigns.
Right. The argument advanced is that accusation is utilized as a weapon to destroy cultural symbols. In the 1980s, Bill Cosby, through the character of Cliff Huxtable, presented a monolithic cultural model of aspirational present authoritative fatherhood.
The source argues this was a vital, stabilizing counterimage during a historical period when the two-parent family structure was collapsing across all demographics, but particularly in minority communities.
And the destruction of that symbol didn't start in a courtroom. It began with a viral comedy routine in 2014, which acted as a catalyst. That was followed almost immediately by highly coordinated waves of accusers, many organized by a single high-profile attorney.
The cultural erasure was instantaneous and absolute. Decades of reruns were pulled from syndication overnight. Honorary degrees from dozens of universities were rescinded within weeks. Statues were dismantled.
The Huxtable model of fatherhood was obliterated from the cultural landscape before a single criminal charge was ever filed, let alone proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law.
The speed of it was breathtaking, and even though Cosby's eventual criminal conviction was later completely overturned and vacated by the state Supreme Court due to egregious prosecutorial misconduct, meaning the state violated his constitutional rights to get the conviction, the cultural destruction remains entirely permanent.
The source suggests these high-profile cases represent a targeted attack on the very concept of aspirational fatherhood and paternal authority. The mechanism of destruction operates entirely outside the boundaries of the courts.
The accusation itself is the execution. The trial is just a post-mortem formality.
The author connects this back to historical philosophy, and it proves that we used to understand the gravity of this. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, ranked the covert destruction of a man's reputation as a more grievous fundamental sin than theft.
Taking a man's good name, Aquinas argued, is a crafty blow in the dark. It robs him of his ability to participate in social and economic life. You are literally exiling him from the human community.
The essay also brings in Shakespeare to articulate the exact nature of this asymmetry. Iago in Othello perfectly captures the malice of indirect aggression. He says that he who filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him and makes me poor indeed.
That is the crux of it. If you steal my car or my money, you gain a car or money, there's a material transfer.
Right. But if you steal my reputation with a false whisper, you don't gain a reputation. You just leave me completely destitute. It is pure nihilistic destruction.
Yet today, if a woman burns down a man's physical house, the police will arrest her for arson. But if she makes a false phone call to his employer, or circulates a lie in a whisper network that destroys his career, his marriage, and his mental health, she faces zero consequences.
The architecture of our society protects the arsonist if she uses invisible fire. And the essay asks a critical, pragmatic question. If we recognize that a whisper can destroy a life just as thoroughly as a weapon, what do we do about it? How do we balance the scales of justice?
The author actually offers a concrete framework for what they call symmetric justice. It demands that covert mobbing be recognized as a legally actionable category of harm with the same severity as overt sexual harassment.
It demands the immediate repeal of laws like the Ghomeshi rules that shield lying accusers.
It demands serious, mandatory, and proportionate legal penalties for perjury and sexual assault claims.
But the most intriguing proposal is the creation of a formal defamation registry. The mechanism works like this. If someone circulates a serious, unsubstantiated accusation like pedophilia, rape, or severe abuse, the target of that whisper could file a formal public notice.
The accuser would then be legally compelled, given 30 days, to either file a formal, sworn police report, thereby subjecting themselves to the legal penalties of perjury if they are lying, or they must publicly retract the statement.
And if they refuse to do either,
then their name goes on a permanent public registry as having made a verified, unsubstantiated accusation.
So the goal is not to silence victims. The goal is to remove the anonymity and the absolute costlessness of the whisper network. It forces the accuser to put skin in the game and stand behind their words under penalty of law.
It is a fascinating legal concept. It doesn't prevent anyone from seeking justice. It just demands accountability for trying to destroy someone outside the justice system.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, and the through line is incredibly dark. We started with the history of domestic violence intervention, tracing how the desperate need to overcome state apathy led to the blind adoption of the Duluth model.
We saw the founders of that model admit in their own writing to ideological bias, confess to ignoring scientific evidence, and detail how they pushed a rigid algorithmic framework that assumed male guilt and female innocence as a foundational premise.
We followed how that fraudulent ideology translated directly into mandatory arrest and no-drop policies, leading to the systemic arrest and traumatization of innocent, heavily injured male victims who were simply treated as variables by a blind state algorithm.
From there, we expanded into the architecture of institutional blindness. We saw how HR departments, Title IX offices, and the law itself function as a one-way ratchet.
They heavily punish the direct, overt aggression typical of men, while remaining entirely blind and sometimes actively protective of the covert, reputational, indirect aggression typical of women.
The overarching theme across all these sources is that well-intentioned systems designed to protect the vulnerable have ossified. They've hardened into asymmetric, fraudulent structures that systematically deny male victimhood while offering absolute impunity to female perpetrators of psychological and physical harm.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling thought pulled from the depths of the Multiverse Journal essay. It is a hypothesis about mass violence that we didn't fully unpack earlier, and it points to a terrifying blind spot in our academic and sociological research.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and it is chilling.
Let's get into it.
When we look at the horrific phenomenon of workplace or school shooters, the academic and media consensus usually codes their motivations as acting out of paranoid ideation, toxic masculinity, or generic workplace conflict.
They are dismissed as pathological anomalies, monsters who simply snapped.
But the essay asks a profound question. What if researchers actually looked at these tragedies through the lens of mobbing?
Right. What if, instead of just looking at the final explosive moment of violence, they analyzed the social environment leading up to the tragedy to see if the perpetrator was actually the victim of sustained, coordinated, covert aggression?
The author proposes the destruction in place hypothesis. Imagine a person trapped by financial obligations, unable to quit their job, or a teenager unable to leave their school.
Just stuck.
Over months or years, they are subjected to invisible, coordinated psychological torture, whispers, exclusion, gaslighting, reputational sabotage. And because the institution is structurally blind to covert aggression, the victim has absolutely no recourse.
HR won't help. The administration blames them. No one believes them.
They are trapped in a burning building where no one else admits there is smoke.
That is a terrifying thought.
Exactly. Layman's clinical research proved this causes PTSD-equivalent trauma and massive suicide rates. The psyche collapses under the weight of the isolation.
So the author suggests that some of these horrific, seemingly senseless acts of mass violence, which almost always end in the perpetrator's suicide, are the terminal, explosive result of this invisible psychological destruction.
It's the ultimate tragic consequence of a system refusing to see the invisible weapon. A trapped, traumatized victim making the invisible visible at a catastrophic cost to the entire community.
And the essay notes that the academic establishment entirely refuses to study this connection, largely because it would implicate the very institutional cultures that protect and reward covert aggression. It leaves you wondering how many of these unspeakable tragedies could be prevented if we finally acknowledge the lethal power of the covert whisper and build systems to stop it.
It is a dark thought, but a necessary one to ponder if we truly want to understand the limits and the failures of our current societal frameworks. We like to think our diagnostic X-ray machines for social harm are infallible, but as these sources argue, we might be actively refusing to look at half the skeleton.
We started this deep dive talking about diagnostic muddy waters, and I think we've thoroughly mapped the currents underneath today. Thank you for joining us on this intense intellectual journey. We encourage you to keep questioning the structures around you, to look for the invisible dynamics in your own workplaces and communities, and to always, always ask whose story the system is designed to ignore. Until next time.